Happy Friday, everybody. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you watch the entire thing to get what you need in order to understand today's lesson. So first things first, obviously the video is going to help you today to do a few things. Number one, you're going to be finishing your brochure. So if you need to pause the video now to make sure you have your paper brochure, that's what you need for the first part of this video to finish the Southern Colonies portion of your notes. And then after that, you need to get the directions for the next part, which is looking at artifacts in order to understand what life in the colonies may have been like. And then finally today, you're going to have a quick check for understanding. It's open note. It is a graded task, but I'm not putting it in Power School, but I do want to see that everybody gets at least a 9 out of 10 on it before the end of today. If you do not finish that check, it is going to become homework over the weekend. All right, let's get started. So yesterday we learned about what life was like in the colonies, specifically in the New England colonies, as well as the middle colonies. Today we're going to start by finishing your brochure, the specific section about the southern colonies. So really quickly here, make sure you're following along. We're going to be filling in those blanks. So first things first, yesterday we, right before the bell rang, finished up talking about the middle colonies. And again, a lot of this is review from your 13 colonies timeline. But specifically, we talked about how in colonies like Pennsylvania that were established by the Quakers, they started to build a representative government. They used something called the General Assembly, where there were elected officials and town meetings to make decisions. They also practiced things like religious tolerance, but they did not necessarily allow women involved in government or other people from other faiths and or ethnicities to participate fully in government in Pennsylvania. Now, they did have a social structure in this system, and it's very similar to other colonies, but also a little bit unique, and we will be comparing these. In the middle colonies, we had this top class, this upper class called the gentry, which was farm and or company owners, especially company owners in places like New York City and Philadelphia. And then below that, we had sort of small farms, shop owners, and smaller landowners. This group could also vote. And then the lowest level included indentured servants, enslaved people, and the poor. Especially in some of those urban areas. And once they started moving further west, we saw a lot of diversity within those units as well. Now, we're going to wrap up the southern colonies next. In the southern colonies, environment really drove so much of the economy. That's because there was warm weather and fertile soil, which led to an ideal farmland for cash crops on what are called plantations, which are these massive pieces of land that operated as self-functioning, self-sustaining societies to grow things like tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton, which meant that it was a very rural and agricultural setup in colonies like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia that relied heavily on agriculture to make their money. It was an agricultural economy, which means that there were fewer cities. There was one, which was Charleston, South Carolina, was really the only major sort of metropolitan or urban area at the time. Georgia, just a reminder from your notes, was what was called the debtors' colony, where people could work off their debt by farming, eventually earning ownership of that land through these agreements with the landowners in Georgia specifically. This setup, maybe more than any of the other regions, really drove so much of social structure in the southern colonies, of government in the southern colonies, of daily life, all of it. A plantation is what you're really going to be learning about when you go turn to the artifacts momentarily. And a plantation was, like I said, this massive farm that operated to produce as much tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton as the land would allow. And so these plantations were fully functioning, if you can imagine, like tiny towns. And oftentimes, especially if you were not, owning the plantation, you would spend your entire life tied to that land and working on that land. And so, like I said, that drove a lot of what happened throughout the rest of society, including a very heavy reliance on enslaved labor to produce these cash crops. We saw the southern colonies using that enslaved labor more than any of the other regions in the British colonies. Now, government, you may have guessed it, it's very similar to the other colonies. Landowning white men were the elected representatives to these county-wide assemblies. They did not function specifically well, and that is because they were really, really spread out. They did have Virginia, which was this house of burgesses that existed in places like Jamestown, and they were seen as sort of the example that other colonies could copy. But many southern colonies really struggled with governing because everything was so spread out. In addition, there was also a lot of diversity in certain parts. For example, Georgia was a debtor's colony, while Maryland was entirely organized under Catholicism. The Carolinas and Georgias were often the Church of England. There was a lot going on, and everything was very spread out, which meant that government, although there were attempts to create systems of self-governance, was not particularly effective. We did see there was a combination, especially in places like Maryland, of religion with government. We saw baptisms happening in the same building as laws being passed, for example. We saw death sentences being carried out alongside church services in places throughout this region as well, because there were these meeting places that were multi-use spaces. And so we'll talk more about that as we continue to talk about how government formed in the colonial era. Lastly, the social structure there, and again, like I said, everything's really driven by the environment here. There were very few schools because everything was so spread out. Most children received little or no education. Wealthy children could pay for tutors to travel to the plantations or to maybe neighboring plantations where students could visit, but education was not a priority. And if there was educational elements happening, it was much more focused on producing the next generation of workers and plantation owners. So it was very much this cycle. Anywhere from 20 to 60% of the population was enslaved, which meant that there was obviously a huge demand for enslaved labor for cash crops, but also that the dynamics between these two groups, these power structures, was really, really, really divided. There was a very big distinction between the groups, and it was very race-based in these southern colonies as well. Very, very different depending on who you were in these regions. There was no ability to move up, for example, between social classes. So the next step is to look at the rest of the brochure, which are these boxes that say artifact at the top. Your task is to find at least 2 artifacts per region. So 2 artifacts for the New England colonies, 2 artifacts for the middle colonies, and 2 artifacts for the southern colonies. Your task is to try and infer and understand what those artifacts tell us about daily life in the colony. So you're going to use these slideshows that I've posted for you on Schoology to pull these artifacts from. But in the boxes, you're going to write the name of the artifact from the slide. You're going to list specific textual evidence from that source or the description if it's a piece of artwork. I'll show you some examples in a second. And then you're going to tell me a little bit about daily life and what that artifact tells you about daily life. So, for example, we already talked about the New England colonies, about the Mayflower Compact yesterday. But let's say the Mayflower Compact were our artifact. Okay, so in the box, you would write the Mayflower Compact, and then your task would be to use the text here and trying to pull out something that teaches you something about what life was like in that region. So as I'm reading, having undertaken from the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, we read this yesterday, and the honor of our king, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, blah, blah, blah. I notice as I'm reading, it says, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. Okay, first of all, what does body politic mean? They spelled politic, right? Or wrong, excuse me. And then when I did some investigation, I learned that it's the people of a nation, state, or society considered collectively as an organized group of citizens. It's everyone together. So if we read this phrase back, working together or combining ourselves together into a group of people collectively for our better ordering and preservation, okay, for survival, this tells me that people in Pilgrim Society especially really prioritize this idea of collective action, of working together for the common good of the colony. And so that may have impacted life in a variety of ways, but it definitely meant that power was very evenly distributed throughout society in order to make sure that everybody got what they need to be successful. So when I put it all into our artifact here, I put the Mayflower Compact as the title. And then the evidence I pulled is the quote I just talked about. And then the inference about daily life, again, this is my perspective on the evidence. This shows that in Pilgrim Society, the settlers wanted to work together as a society to support one another through their faith and hard work, common good, this idea. They really prioritized that. Again, you're going to have at least 2 of these filled out for every region. The slideshows are posted in Schoology. If you scroll from the Daily Agenda folder to the Colonial Life folder, you'll see there's a folder that says Life in the Colonies Artifacts. There's a bunch of links to slideshows that have the artifacts. There's more than 2 options in here, so you're only picking 2 out. Okay, some of them are artwork, some of them are cartoons, some of them are primary sources, some of them are videos. For example, as I mentioned yesterday, the Salem witch trials happened in Puritan, Massachusetts Bay Colony. You can read there and watch the video about it. And same thing in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. Your task is to use these, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to use that interest you, to fill in at least 2 of those artifact boxes, on your brochure. You do not need to submit this. Instead, what you're going to do then before class is over today is complete this Life in the Colonies, check for understanding. You need to score at least a 9 out of 10 on it. All right, happy Friday, everybody. Have a good day.